Hi, this is Frank, and welcome back to the next Realignment. In this episode, we're going to talk about how political parties actually change over time and how that process creates realignments. When we're going to talk about realignments, that means we're going to have to talk about American political parties and how they actually change over time. Because a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about the process and how it works. For one thing, a lot of people believe incorrectly that American political parties change gradually over time as it's a process of evolution. And that's not really the case. If you look at what actually happens, political parties in America change in radical bursts. Parties do change gradually in the small ways, right? They change in the issues that they focus on. New issues come up. Parties have to respond. And sometimes they change demographically in small ways. You see groups of people kind of shift from one party to the other, small groups. That doesn't mean that the parties are actually changing in big ways. Now, ideologically, what they stand for, what they represent, and what they believe, they don't change much at all. In fact, they basically, once parties form and they form a new party ideology, they hold the same for decades and decades and decades with very little change until suddenly something big happens, and in a very short period of time, those parties radically collapse and then get completely remade from scratch. So it's not really a process of evolution at all. It's actually a process of short bursts of radical change followed by long periods of stability. Now, the other thing that a lot of people believe that's not true is that American political parties, that what they effectively do is they represent positions on this idea of a left-right spectrum. So a lot of people have been taught that there is a spectrum of issues from left to right, and that we can basically line up all the issues in America or in any country at any time into a neat line. We call one side the left and one the right, and that what political parties do is they represent their side of the spectrum and they tug back and forth over the middle of the line, trying to pull the country a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. But that's also really not true. Now, we're going to talk more about the left-right spectrum in later episodes, and we'll talk about why it's actually a myth. It doesn't really exist. In reality, American political parties represent discrete ideologies that are formed at a time and place to deal with a set of issues right then, and each of them are unique. They're not liberalism or conservatism, left and right as we define it today. They're unique things that were developed at a certain point in time to deal with issues and to deal with a certain place in America. And then once they collapse, new things happen that are unlike anything that had existed before. So that's how parties work. And what we've seen is that there's in fact 5 distinct sets of parties that we've had in America that scholars call party systems, right? So it was the first party system that you've heard of with Hamilton and Jefferson, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, right? That was this debate that these two parties were having in the early republic over what this new republic would be. And then there was a second party system. When the first one collapsed, then you saw the rise of Andrew Jackson and this new party called the Democrats. And then they fought off against this new party called the Whigs, and that was the second party system. And they were having this new debate about how to build America into the frontier. And then there was a third party system that happened when that second party system collapsed and led to a civil war. And then we had 2 new parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. And they were having this fight over the issues of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then those parties eventually came down when those issues kind of faded into the past. And there were the new problems of industrialization, and that led to the populist and progressive era. Now, we had 2 parties, again called Democrats and Republicans, but they were effectively new parties. They stood for different ideas, and they were having a different debate over the populist and progressive era as they tried to drag the United States into a new era of industrialization and reform. And that was the parties that existed until our own era in 1932. Those old parties collapsed, and we had this new revolution in politics called the New Deal. And we had this new version of the Democratic Party that happened under FDR, and they created New Deal liberalism. And then in response, You had this new idea that took over the Republican Party that had become effectively a husk, and that was conservatism. And they started a new debate between liberalism and conservatism in 1932. And that's the fifth party system that has existed throughout our lives. But in fact, we created it right then in the New Deal. And just like all the other party systems, it's unique, ideologically unique, geared to a certain time and place in history, and has been having this fight stably, the same stable fight over decades. So there's a couple of things that probably jump out at you with this. Now, the first one is you probably notice that these party changes, I'm not talking about institutions, right? Sometimes when we see a change in parties, you see a change in party names. You see an institution die, like the Whigs, which no longer exist, or the Democratic Republicans, or the Federalists. You know, the Republicans and the Democrats, when they were created, they were brand new parties as institutions. And we've seen third parties that happen sometimes that come and go during these realigning processes, like the know-nothings, also called the American Party. So we've had Republicans and Democrats for a long time, but we've also had very different versions of Democrats and Republicans. Republicans and Democrats for a long time stood for one thing, then they collapsed, then they stood for something different. They had a different ideology, different ideological factions, and that they were practically a brand new party. It doesn't really matter what you call them. It's not about the name. It's about what the parties represent. Okay. Now, the second thing you probably notice is that you didn't see on that list like 1968 or 1980. There's a lot of people have this idea that there was a realignment in the middle of the 20th century in this country. But that's also not true, because now there were big changes at that time, and they're very important changes, and we'll talk about them later on in the series. But what they weren't were ideological changes. See, the Republicans have represented conservatism. They've been fighting big government since 1932. And the Democrats, they've represented New Deal liberalism and been pushing forward their ideology of New Deal liberalism or liberalism since 1932. They have ideologically not changed at all. Their focus have changed, and demographically there's been changes. But they've been the same party really throughout our lifetimes going back to there. So each of these party systems, you see, are ideologically unique, okay? They don't represent conservatives and liberals as we know them today. And just to give you one example, so the party system right before the New Deal party system, there was the populist and progressive era, and there were Democrats and Republicans, but you had the Democratic Party was probably best represented by William Jennings Bryan. He was a populist. He was for workers and the little guy. He hated money elites and big companies. But he also, he was an evangelical Christian. He was a moralist. He eventually fought for temperance. He wasn't in any way the sort of person that we would today really call liberal. He was a little of both. He doesn't really fit into the same spectrum. And then you also see somebody like Teddy Roosevelt, who was the most powerful Republican at the era. Well, he was pro-business, and the Republicans in the era were considered a pro-business party. But at the same time, they were the biggest vehicle for the progressive movement. They were moral reformers. They were fighting for changes in child labor laws and trying to make the country better and fighting for progressive ideas. And that worked together in the party, where the pro-business side and the progressive side worked together as one party in unison, and they didn't even see that as conflicting. So they weren't liberals and they weren't conservatives. They were something else. And what that tells you is when our party system ends, what comes next will also be not liberal or conservative or more conservative, but something else. So that's party systems. So what are realignments? Well, realignments are just the transitions between these party systems. See, when a party system collapses after being the same for a long time, and then you have this traumatic era where the old system falls down, everything falls apart, there's a period of chaos, or at least redefinition, and new people come together and form new majorities to create new parties. And those transitions are what we call realignments. Now, the problem is, we use this word realignment casually today, and a lot of people use it incorrectly to mean things that aren't really a realignment. So, for example, a lot of people will talk about shifts in demographics as a realignment. So, when a party is going to capture the suburbs or the soccer mom vote or some other demographic group, and they think, well, that will change how many votes we get, and that is going to be a realignment, sometimes dreaming of a permanent majority, something that in America doesn't actually exist. There is not and will never be a permanent majority for any party. So there's this idea that that's what a realignment is, but that's not really right at all. Realignments aren't about demographic shifts or about which party's up and which is down. They're ideological redefinitions of what the parties fundamentally mean. So the other thing that you hear about realignments is people think it's about, again, institutions. When realignments happen, now sometimes there's party replacement. A lot of times there's a fundamental change. You see parties die and new parties arise to actually knock them off. And this is what you saw with the Whigs or with the Federalists. And that's something that can and does happen, but not always. See, sometimes in a realignment, you see a party fundamentally change what it stands for while keeping the same brand name. And it happens for a bunch of reasons. Sometimes it's because a party becomes really, really weak and it has new people rush into it with new ideas and take it over and change it. Now, it's kind of like what happened with the Republicans during the New Deal era. Under Hoover, the Republicans collapsed and there was new energy around FDR. And a bunch of people came up who wanted to oppose FDR, and they found themselves in the one available vehicle, what was left of the Republican Party. And they created a new party using the institution and brand name that existed. And what they created was new, but it was under the institutional framework of what had been old. The other thing you often see is what is effectively a hostile takeover. You could see this like in 1896, there was a third party called the People's Party, often called the Populist Party. And they were winning governors and senators races, and they were doing really well. And in 1896, in the Democratic convention, they nominated somebody with populist sensibilities, and he basically took the populist movement and its party and its ideas. He ripped out the guts of the party as it existed, and he replaced it with these new ideas. And he created what was effectively a new Democratic Party. Now, that story often gets told that the Democrats co-opted the populists. But of course, I see it very differently. And many people do, because if you look at it, what really happened was the Populist Party took over the Democrats and kept the old brand name. And that's, of course, something you see a lot of times in business. When a small company takes over a bigger company with a better brand, they keep the better brand. But that doesn't mean that the big company acquired the small company. It's very much the opposite. So the system, when you look at it, it doesn't work like people often assume. It works really like this. In a moment of crisis, usually in the wake of an old party collapse, you see new parties form, two new parties with two new ideologies and ideas to deal with whatever is the biggest problem looming in the country at the time, what I call a grand issue. Now, a grand issue is not like a normal political issue, just like sort of a come and go, normal push and pull of politics. I'm talking about a major change in the country, something that is completely remaking what America is and how it works, and that the old parties, the way they were built, weren't built to address and don't really have the tools to address. So it's something like the Industrial Revolution, changing from an agricultural to an industrial economy and shaking up absolutely everything and requiring a complete rethinking of not just how politics works, but how the government works and how society works. Or you could say a similar thing, like when the country moved west and went from a bunch of colonies hugging the coast to a country spanning a continent. Well, that required a complete rethinking of how America worked as an entity and as a country. And the old parties couldn't deal with it, and we needed new parties to deal with it. Or modernization, as it had changed America in the wake of the Depression and the Second World War. You had a new version of America that the old parties weren't really built to address and that somebody had to deal with. That's a grand issue, and that creates all the smaller political issues and frames how we see the smaller political issues. So when we have a grand issue like that, you get new parties, they have new ideologies built to fight and approach and solve somehow that grand issue. And they have an ideological debate, like the debate we've had in our era between conservatives and liberals, between conservatism and liberalism. And we've had similar fights in other eras as they try to address the problem. And then eventually over time, decades and decades pass, and we either solve the issue or we move past it. And we move to a new era where there's new problems that the old framework weren't really made to address. So the binds that keep the party together get weaker because they were built to deal with problems that don't exist anymore or problems that we solved. And at the same time, we've got new problems that they don't know how to deal with and don't have a framework for. So they get weaker and they start getting pulled apart and eventually they blow up and implode. And when they do, we've got a new crisis and we create two new parties that create a new era in the next realignment. So looking at that and understanding that process and looking at our era, as we'll see, it seems kind of obvious why the next realignment should be around the corner. We've built our parties in 1932. They're New Deal parties. They've been built to fight the ideas of an industrial country in the wake of a depression and the Cold War world that doesn't exist. And that's the debate they've been having since 1932, is a debate over FDR and his policies. And it was really relevant then, and it was relevant for decades since. But it's problems we've long since solved. And we have new problems. We have these problems of this post-industrial America that's happening. Problems our parties don't know how to deal with. And they're pulling the whole system down. And as we go through this series, we'll see how all the problems that we face and the situation we face now fits into the same framework and the same patterns that have happened again and again and again over time. So the question isn't, are we going to have a realignment soon? It's just a question of when and how is it going to play out? And how are we going to handle it to lead to the next era of America? So, thanks for watching. And I hope you'll tune into our next episode where we're going to talk about the two-party system. Both why do we have a two-party system in America and only a two-party system? And why that means that despite a lot of people's hopes, we'll never have a broad-based, long-lasting third party in America.